ask Professor Pietersen for the first question. So for those of us who are not viticulturists or scientists, can you please just highlight what is the grapevine Leafroll virus in the context? What exactly it is and how does it affect the vine? Just give us an overview, please.
Yeah, sure, Moshe. So I think now with COVID-19 being around, it actually makes my life a little bit easier. So the disease is called grapevine Leafroll disease, as COVID-19 describes the disease. But there are a number of viruses that can cause this disease, like the SARS-CoV-2 virus. So probably the most important virus worldwide that causes grapevine leafroll disease is called grapevine leafroll associated virus type 3. I'm just going to refer to it as type 3 from here. That's the one that's prevalent here in South Africa. It's prevalent in Israel. It's starting to become a much bigger problem in California. It's a massive problem in New Zealand as well. It's basically the worldwide problem that gives rise to leafroll. The disease is bad in that it affects the vascular tissue of the vine, and this gives rise to its very striking symptoms, especially in red cultivars, which are these red leaves in autumn and curling of the leaves.
So how does it affect, well, the quality and the yield? What's the biggest effect on the vine?
Well, the fact that it affects the vascular tissue, which is basically the tubes that feed the berries, there are a number of aspects that the virus affects. To start off with, your sugar levels develop a lot slower. So if you're in a climatic area where you've got a relatively short season, you won't reach the sugar levels that you need. It affects, in red cultivars, it affects the color. It affects the yield. So, for example, in South Africa, after about between 15 and 20 years, vineyards are generally replaced because both the yield and the quality of the berries go down. What might interest the viewers is a survey that was done just a year or two ago. Colleagues of mine at Stellenbosch University did an experiment where they collected virus-diseased berries from virus-diseased plants and berries from healthy vines, and then they made wine in a very standard method. So the winemaker didn't alter his method to adjust to the juice that he was getting. He made a standard method. And then we had 30 of the country's top winemakers assess the wine. And I'll give you a word cloud as to what they've actually found in one cultivar. I hope this works easily enough. If you'll just give me a moment to find that word cloud. So if I can explain this word cloud, you can see the three different blocks. One is the healthy vines, and then there are two different vines, two different blocks which had infected vineyards. And the winemakers who did the tasting didn't have a clue what the experiment was about. They didn't even know that this was about virus at all. And you can see they gave out of a possible 20 points, this is Cabernet Sauvignon, the healthy vine received 16.2 out of 20, whereas both infected vines, wine from infected vines, had much lower scores. If you also look at the word cloud, you'll see that terms like blackberry, raspberry, these flavors were coming up much stronger in the wine from healthy vines. So clearly it affects the wine quality as well.
It's quite interesting there, Prof, that I see within all of those word clouds, dried fruit appears in the healthy vines, yes, overripe fruit, and then in particular in the one on the extreme right column, very overripe fruit comes into play. Now, that's quite an odd expectation in my experience, because we've always learned that a virus inhibits ripening. Does that perhaps pertain to phenolic ripening, and whereas sugar ripening still occurs?
Yeah, Cathy, I'm not a winemaker, and I have to be very careful that I stay within my field of expertise. So that might be something that a winemaker would, might be able to give you an answer on. I don't know.
Should we ask a winemaker?
Yeah, it would be interesting.
Alastair, you're sitting in the light tonight. I can see you better tonight. Have you had, I mean, you must have had experience with Cabernet. Can you give us any insight into that word cloud, perhaps?
Not really, to tell you the honest truth, other than I agree with it completely. And it is anecdotal evidence from my career working with fortunately both healthy and unhealthy fruit from a virus standpoint of view. And generally, especially on Cabernet, which is one of those later ripening varieties, I find it particularly sensitive to the negative effects of Leafroll. And it's a bit like a very faint cork taint. It just wipes out the fruit, and it wipes out the intensity of the wine. And Cabernet at its best has got that freshness and that plushness, and the wines become a bit austere. And that dried fruit, it dries the wine out a bit. The plushness of the fruit is lost, and it becomes very neutral. There's still flavors, there's still character to the wine, but with not even close to the intensity of healthy fruit.
Okay, thank you. Moshe, because I had to jump out there, did you ask that first question about?
Yes. We did cover the quality and yield, the effect, but I'm sure that we'll touch on it again. And Professor Pietersen was able to explain in general terms about what is the virus, and the fact that we're talking mainly about the strain 3. So yes, it was answered.
Okie dokie. So Prof, Leafroll virus was discovered in South Africa as far back as 1936. I wasn't born yet. I don't think many of us on this program were. But whenever you mention Leafroll in wine circles, the knee-jerk reaction is that it is only a South African problem. Is this true? Do you think that South Africa is the only country that has really high incidences of Leafroll in its vineyards?
Cathy, no. The short answer there is definitely not. This is a worldwide problem. It is serious in most countries that I've visited. Ironically, I think the problem with the disease has been that it has been so ubiquitous in viticulture that until we didn't have a control, a sort of a healthy vineyard, no one really knew what the potential of vineyards were. So it's only once we really got clean planting material and were able to actually control the spread of the virus that we could see the massive effect that the virus had. And a lot of countries are only coming to that realization now. So no, it's worldwide. I just want to take you back a couple of steps. It was the disease that was discovered in the 30s in South Africa. The virus itself was actually discovered by one of by a South African as well. My predecessor, Mr. Engelbrecht, was one of the first people to actually discover the virus itself. And that would have been in about 1980.
Okay.
Talking about the fact that it's associated with South Africa, I agree. It's I have to admit that talking about Leafroll, until recently, the first thing that came to my mind was South Africa. But researching for this evening, I've seen papers from all over, even regions that are pretty new, like Finger Lake has research papers that saying, I know that there were all sorts of fruit plantations there for generations, so they share it with the vine, but they have the problem there. And of course, New Zealand and California.
Yeah.
So.
You have to keep in mind that vines have been propagated through vegetative propagation over millennia. And most of the New World countries have actually received their initial planting material from Europe. So basically, just about all of the different viruses that cause leafroll are present in just about all of the countries where planting material was obtained from Europe in the 1700s and so.
Okay. And we didn't cover how it was spread, did we?
No.
And does the vector remain the same in every country in which we're looking at?
Cathy, the vectors are both mealybugs and scale insects. And there are a number of species of both of those two groups of insects. And most mealybug species that feed on grapevines will transmit the virus. Now, different countries have different mealybugs. So, for example, the one that we have that's really prevalent in South Africa is called Planococcus ficus.
Wow.
And that's the same one, by the way, Moshi, that's in Israel. Now, New Zealand doesn't have that particular species at all. They have a different set of species. But most of these mealybugs can transmit the virus at just different levels of efficiency.
I was going to ask you, which is the uber mealybug? Like the African bee is one of the biggest bees around the world. Is there an uber mealybug?
Without a doubt, the Planococcus ficus, the one we have here.
Oh,
It wasn't present in California up until about, probably about 15, 20 years ago. And my colleagues in California tell me that that leafroll wasn't spreading that fast prior to that. But since Planococcus ficus has arrived in California, they are getting massive spread on the same level as we see now, as we've seen in South Africa for a while. So they're also getting really serious about controlling leafroll.
And any indication where it came from in California? I mean, I know that every time I go to Australia, they make me wash my shoes, but I've never had to wash my shoes when going into the USA.
Yes, Australia and New Zealand are extremely efficient in their quarantine systems. Neither of them have Planococcus ficus, and they also don't have a number of pests and diseases which other countries in the world have. And because they're, either it's a single country sort of surrounded by sea, they have very, very effective quarantine and phytosanitary regulations. California, with the advent of Planococcus ficus there, things have really changed. Initially, they had hoped to contain the spread of Planococcus ficus, but it seems to have moved through most of California at this stage.
And could you outline for us the reasons why the virus got such a grip on South Africa in the first place? Or was it just that we opened our eyes amongst the first people?
I think possibly we, for some reason, recognized the problem first, really, as something that needs attention. I don't know if our situation is much worse than, say, in Israel. I think hotter areas in general would be more prone to this disease because the mealybugs, all the different species of mealybugs, are heat sensitive in the sense that the hotter it is, the shorter their generation. So they get to be adults quicker. And so in South Africa, we could, on a hot season, we could easily have 6 or 7 generations of mealybugs. Whereas in a cooler climate, the number of generations would be lower, and consequently the number, the sheer number of individuals would be lower as well.
And how do you go about identifying which vines are actually infected with Leafroll virus?
On red cultivars, it takes a little bit of a trained eye, but it's very easy. Aidan, would you agree with me there?
Yeah, it's much easier. It's much easier on red, and then on the whites where the leaves curl, like Chardonnay. Yeah. It makes it a lot easier. I think long before you see leaf symptoms, you should be able to spot the prevalence or the movement of the mealybug. So and they'll be visible long before there's any leaf symptoms in the season. So I think it's all about training up staff and training up the guys in the vineyards at the minute they see any activity, either through the activity of ants, which is often an associated insect with the complex. But if during early season activities like suckering or moving of canopy wires or any of the early season activities that they see any mealybug, those vines are flagged. We then come and treat them individually. We'll mark them. We'll mark the end of the row where we found those vines. And so the symptoms that everyone refers to, the red leaves, that you really only see towards the late stages of harvest and into autumn. And by then it's too late. So yeah, I think it's easier on reds late season, but you should be looking out for the mealybug all through the season.
Okay, Aidan, that's quite a nice segue. If we can ask you, as you said right in the beginning that you're only the farmer here, can you tell us what the farmer does to combat the spread of virus in the vineyard?
Yeah, sure. I think sadly, not enough farmers take this seriously enough, or I must be careful what I say, but I'm shocked to see how bad some farms look this time of the year now, in end of May, early June, around the Western Cape. And I think it's a disease that can be controlled. I was at a seminar many years ago that Gerhard himself presented, and where we first heard the concept of roguing, of removing infected vines. And we adopted that immediately. And it's been our protocol ever since, of vines that have slipped through and have got infected, is to rogue them, to remove them completely from the vineyard. But when you discuss that with growers and you move around the industry and you talk to people about, are you ever going to consider that, they think you're mad. They sort of get to a point where they say, well, the vineyard's infection is too high, what's the point of it? And they let it slip. So what we do at Takora, I think it all started with training our staff. I mean, it's all very well having viticulturists and winemakers attending fancy seminars and getting all the knowledge, but if the guys right out there in the vineyards are not trained up with you and are as passionate about combating this disease, you're never going to win that battle. So for a normal vineyard, I'll address young vineyards and replants and new developments, but for a standard vineyard that's in production, we try and have a complete zero tolerance attitude with the virus. So every single vine that gets infected, we remove. If we're suspicious of possible other symptoms, and it's quite easy to identify them, but there are some nutritional problems that do exhibit dark sort of brown and red leaves towards the end of the season. We then take samples off to Viticulturalists, and we have ELISA testing just to confirm, and those are individual samples. But
sorry, for the wine students amongst us, can you explain ELISA in a little bit briefly?
I think Gerhard would be the one that would be more versed at the science behind the ELISA testing. No,
well, then let's come back to that then. Sorry to have interrupted you.
No, that's fine. So that's one strategy, is to remove any infected vines. And I'm just sitting here with a piece of paper which I got this afternoon from one of my guys giving me the virus counts of the individual blocks. And these are vineyards that probably have between 3 and 4, maybe 5, but probably 2,000, 3,000 vines. And here's some of the numbers. This particular block: 6 vines, 7 vines, 4 vines, 11 vines, 9 vines, 22 vines, 7 vines. So those are the sort of numbers which is below 1% that we are removing. And there's no debate about that. Those vines get removed. We then leave that space blank for probably 2 seasons, sometimes 3. And then if we think we're going to be successful with an interplant, we'll replace that with the exact same rootstock clone combination. But then during the season as well, we release natural predators. We place our traps in the vineyards to try and count the activity of the males, to see if there's an early spike in activity. A lot of that is weather related. There are some chemical treatments that you can use. In young vines, we sometimes use a systemic chemical that we send through the drippers to try and assist with the early development. And I think the biggest one, which Gerhard mentioned there, which is the strategy that all of us are adopting, is to make sure you're getting clean material from the start. Yeah. So when you design a new vineyard, you need to go to whatever length it takes to ensure you've got clean plant material. And if it means registering some of your blocks as mother blocks on your property to ensure you're getting foundation material, or you're getting great planting material, that's one strategy. But monitoring, I think it's all about monitoring the ants, monitoring, as I say, early season. And the guys are skilled enough. I mean, these insects are tiny. These mealybugs are really, really small. But a trained staff and trained workers spot them early season at sort of 30 centimeter shoot length. They're really spotted if there's any mealybug early season activity. We try and stay away as much as we can from the chemical treatment. Or there they are. I mean, that's quite a zoomed in picture of mealybugs. They're a lot smaller than that in real life. So that's a high magnification shot. But yeah, that's what they look like. And it's awful if it slips through and it actually gets to infecting the bunches, because they get messy and they look terrible. So we've got a system where our guys have got some red plastic tape in their pockets, and anytime during the season they spot a suspicion of mealybug or a suspicion of the symptoms, they'll mark that vine, and we'll track it through the season, and then we'll go and remove it. And you've got to be ruthless, because if you let it slip, we've got a few vineyards close to our property where the owners have not paid it any attention, and it looks terrible. And that is an infection source. So during the summer, with the prevalent southeaster winds blowing, birds moving around, who are also maybe feeding and moving around through the canopies with mealybug attached to them and wind blowing, we get infected from neighboring properties, and that's a big threat, apart from our own machinery moving around.
Yeah, that plays nicely against 2 of the questions that we've got in here. We've got one from Alberto, who says, do weather patterns have any influence or effect on the incidence of virus? And then Angela Lloyd is asking, is it true that the virus spreads more easily in a monoculture than in a less vine populated area like the Swartland? If I can add on something like that, do windbreaks help?
It's one of the recommendations. It's one of the strategies, if you can angle them perpendicular to the prevailing winds. We've got one vineyard neighboring a property which has a high infestation of mealybug, and we've planted olive trees and a thick hedge along the line. It's difficult to measure that. I think you just feel like you try anything. You try anything to prevent the spread. But I mean, coming to the monoculture question, I mean, all vineyards are monoculture. So if you get one vine infected in the block and it slowly moves down the line, your entire vineyard is a monoculture. I mean, down to the specific clone, it's even more of a monoculture. So I think all modern farming there's a threat, whether you're farming with corn or berries or whatever. If you've got a disease or a bug that likes one plant, it's going to like them all. So yeah, I think that is obviously something we've got to fight against. But the young vineyard, I think also a lot of farms turn vineyards around too quickly. They'll pull out an infested a virus block, and they're obviously keen to get back into production and get income going and get it's a long journey to get back into full production. And I've seen vineyards that have turned around too quickly, and there is residual mealybug activity on weeds and in the soil, and very quickly the new investment is ruined, and then the numbers are too high. So I think people must also sort of give it at least. We always use 3 years between vineyards, of the few that we have pulled out and replanted. Maybe they were the wrong cultivars or some design we wanted to improve, but if there was any evidence of mealybug, we always give it a 3-year gap before we replant.
If
Yes,
I
that
can
was-
just come in there.
Yeah.
Sorry, Cathy. I think Angela means when an area is highly planted to vineyards as opposed to more isolated blocks. It certainly is the case that you get more spread. Generally, that's just because you're planting a new vineyard in the close proximity to very infected vineyards. And that's why this control strategy, which Aidan mentioned, works best when it's done area-wide, when a whole group of producers in an area actually agree in a coordinated manner to control the disease. And as Aidan pointed out very, very clearly, this is not something you do for 1 or 2 seasons. You commit to controlling this disease, it becomes a lot easier after the 3rd, 4th year. You're taking out a lot less vineyards, or vines rather, and but you have to keep at it. Vergelegen have been pretty well virus-free or controlling for Leafroll for about 20 years now, and we still get the odd infected plant through what I believe is probably fairly long distance spread of the mealybug on wind or by birds or something. So you have to keep looking for those infected vines the whole time.
No, I agree. I mean, you can never, I think we probably also coming up for 20 years of that strategy. And I mean, looking at these numbers that I've got in front of me of these blocks, when you're getting 5 vines out of 3,000, then you know you've got it under control. And I don't know if you can show those pictures of the autumn colors that you have there. I think somewhere you've got them. Now that visual there is Cabernet as far as you can see up those lines. And those are just beautiful yellow autumn colors. That particular vineyard in front of you there is R2, and this year we took out 23 vines there. So there's probably, I'm guessing there's probably close to 20,000 vines that you can see in that picture. And if we've taken out more than 20, 25 per block, that's a lot. Some of them have, the numbers I've got here in front of me, 7, 4, 11, 3. So that's you can get to that point, but then as Gerhard said, it's that strategy can never stop. So, I mean, we take great pride in the beautiful yellow autumn colors on the farm because it's hard work, and it is sad when you take a beautiful 10-year-old vine that had been producing stunning fruit, and you have to cut it down to the ground and pull it out. And I can see why farmers don't do it. They probably think, well, it's just going to be a few vines, and the next year it's just a few more, and then it's exponential growth, and then it's too late. So that is.
Sorry, if there's no coordination with neighbors, you acting on your own, and you'll forever do that. You'll forever replant. Okay, small numbers, as you said, because you always with the finger on the pulse. But is it not worth to try to coordinate the region to do bigger blocks?
I think some regions in South Africa, I think Constantia and the Hielman-Ader Valley, Walker Bay, Hermanus, those guys that are geographically in a tighter area have come together, and it's been amazing what they've done, and they've had that strategy. An area like Stellenbosch and Paarl and the Swartland, it's such a vast area. It's more difficult to control, and some of the farms close to us in our valley are so badly infected that unless those guys are willing to pull those vineyards out and start again, there's nothing more that we really can do. So we've got to just protect our own. We've got fantastic neighbors, Thelema, Rustenburg on either side of us, and we all have the same philosophy. But as it gets bigger and bigger and broader, you sort of lose control. So I think those other two valleys I mentioned, Constantia and Hielman Ada, have done a great job of working together and containing this. And that is really the only thing to do, is to follow a strategy like that. But it's expensive. I mean, we buy in fruit at Takora from a few different growers, and we see the vineyards, and we see what some of those farms look like. And if you had to suggest to one of those guys he needs to pull out 3 or 4 vineyards completely and start again, they would say, well, we would rather get maybe not top dollar for what we have, but we can't afford to start again. So that's what we're sitting with. I think we woke up too late as an industry. I think South Africa sadly took too long to really clamp down on this. And I mean, I remember writing a letter probably 20 years ago to the editor of one of our industry magazines, who had on the front cover that year a picture of a certain valley in South Africa with the beautiful, it said the beautiful autumn colors, and it was all virus. And I thought, that's the front cover, and that's, I mean, if these guys don't understand it, we're not going to win this one. So I think it's taken a long time. I think the younger guys are coming out of varsity, and the new generation understands the threat. And as I was saying earlier, with wine quality, it's just very simple to measure the difference. But I think some farms are just too badly infected they'll have to start again.
That's actually interesting, because I think he's still here. Ido Lewinson from Israel sent me an email last week asking me if there was any incentive by the South African government or the South African wine industry as a group for people to grub out vineyards and start again. Ido, is that something that's been mooted in Israel to combat virus there? If you're still with us.
You can talk now, Ido.
Yeah. Can you repeat that, please, Cathy?
Last week, Ido, you sent me an email asking if there was any program by the South African government or the South African wine industry to reimburse or help with the grubbing up of vineyards. Is that a strategy that you're considering in Israel?
Well, I think it will be very helpful, but currently there's no help for or subsidies from the government for doing so. And with us this evening, I counted 4 amazing people from Golan Heights Winery that have done or still doing it on their own, meaning it's a private initiative for the benefit of the winery, and it's an amazing project that they started more than a decade ago with the help of Gerhard. But if region and country will join forces together, producers and growers, it will be much easier. And I've contacted Dr. Bell from New Zealand, where they've done an amazing project in Gimblett Gravels in Ox Bay, and a joint venture is very beneficial, and it's much more rapid in the suppress of the disease. But in those 4 countries, South Africa, Israel, New Zealand, and California or US, to my best knowledge, there's no help, subsidies for the replanting.
Ido, if I can just come in there. California have actually just, literally in the last month or 2, they've actually introduced an incentive for growers to remove infected vines. The state of California has a program where they incentivize that amongst growers. I wish we had that years ago. It would have made such a difference to control of leaf roll. But I just want to point out that while an area-wide control strategy is by far the best, individual growers should still, if they feel they want to improve their wines and with new vineyards, they should go ahead. The most important way that this virus spreads is when it's in a vineyard itself, and that's known as something called secondary spread. The infections that come from the outside are always lower than that particular means of spread. So with a new vineyard, an individual farmer can control the disease. It just takes more effort and it takes much longer. The risk period is while there's healthy vines and infected vines in close proximity.
And that also means sourcing clean material from the nurseries, which was a problem for South Africa in the past. I'm just interested to find out what's the price difference between paying for a guaranteed virus-free little stocky versus one that is not guaranteed virus-free.
We're extremely lucky in South Africa. More than 90% of wine grapes sold in the country actually comes through our certification scheme. And the material you get there over the last decade or so has improved dramatically. You have to keep in mind that the mother blocks within our certification scheme were always just actually commercial vineyards. And if a person wasn't controlling leaf roll in those, then whoever got material from that block was getting infected material. Now we've got all the top estates controlling for leaf roll, and that's where our mother blocks are. So our material is really quite superb at this stage. I should make a slight proviso there, in that it's mainly our red cultivars that we really have a lot of faith in. The white cultivars are still very difficult to ensure that they're virus-free, because to know that the virus is there, you actually have to test it in the laboratory with that technique that we mentioned earlier, ELISA.
So you can now tell us all how ELISA works then, using words of one syllable, please.
Yeah, it's not that difficult. It's an antibody-based technique. So if you take any foreign matter and a mammal, and you get it into a mammal's bloodstream, that mammal creates antibodies. And these antibodies will always bind against that foreign particle. We make use of that system by purifying a virus, in this case, the type 3, making antibodies to it, and then using that ability of these antibodies to bind to the virus, to detect it again. It gets very complicated. It's a simple technique to do, but it's quite a difficult one to explain. But it works superbly.
And the animals we use, are they also vineyard pests?
No. Generally, you produce these under very strict ethical rules within government or university library situations.
Just teasing you. Moshe, we've got quite a few questions here from people. Yes. I think we should run through these. So I know that I had one that Olive Hamilton Russell sent through to me earlier on when she heard we were having this, and I'm very pleased to see that Rosa Kruger, ja, daar sit jy, Rosa.
Yes, Angelique.
And Olive's question was, do you have any idea of what is the virus infection rate in our old vines in the country? Rosa, you can say no if you want to. It's allowed. Eh?
If I can come in there, I haven't done any tests on the really old vines that Rosa is working with, but in vineyards that are in the region of between 15 and 20 years, if leafroll control hasn't been taking place, those vineyards are 100% infected. So I don't imagine it would be too different on the really old vineyards. Okay. Rosa, you might have submitted some of your plants for virus testing. What is your experience around that?
Incredibly interesting, actually. Hello, Cathy. Hello, Professor Pietersen. I must say, I've listened to my first seminar with Professor Pietersen, I think 20 years ago, 15 years ago. And I've been listening to Aidan Morton for as many years. Hello, Aidan, thank you so much for sharing the knowledge you have with us. On old vines, we have the fascinating result. The guys from Antal was here last year testing with the Chenin Blanc Association, because they found that there's some Chenin in South Africa. Well, first of all, they love the Chenin from South Africa. Then they came and sent their 3 gurus to South Africa to test for variety for variety in some of our oldest vineyards, 60 years plus. So you walk around the vineyard and they say to you, but this is not really Chenin, this is Semillon or Riesling or Falsa Pedro or all sorts of other varieties. But then eventually they found that there's selection of Chenin in South Africa, that's extinct in the rest of the world. But amongst other things, they took cuttings, tested it for virus. They took 14 blocks. And of the 14 blocks, there were 4 blocks that were completely clean of all known viruses. They made it very clear to me that I can't say, Professor Pietersen would know, I'm not allowed to say it's clean of all viruses because it's not. It's clean of all known viruses. So why would that be? Why would they be 60 years old standing amongst highly infected vineyards? At Barkan Israel's vineyard up the west coast, there's a Cabernet on the one side and a Merlot on the left side. That's completely red. The Leafroll infested from A to Z, but the Chenin is clean. So all 3 vineyards, Chenin vineyards up in Skirpak, was tested clean. So I said to Nico Spreet, which I'm sure all of us know, was the previous boss of Viticulturalists, the nursery. I said to him, what is the chance of virus resistant? And I see there's a question in that regard by Angela Lloyd. What's the chance of virus resistant material? Not necessarily the variety, but the circumstances in which that vine grows. Something makes it resistant. And Nico Spreet, of course, looked at me and said, you are totally too romantic. Don't go that way. It's only because there's not mealybug. So I rest my case and I went on with my life. And I said, Van Zyl, I said, in Bosie, do you have mealybug in your vineyard? He said, no. What does it look like? So I explained to him, it's a white little, ugly little thing. And it sits on the vine and it eats the vine and there's syrup dripping down. And I explained the whole thing to him. And he said to me, no, I've never seen it before. So then I looked through the list again, and I found there's another vineyard that was clean, and that was in Pikenish Kloof. And Pikenish Kloof, there's a lot of old vineyards in Pikenish Kloof, of course, beautiful vineyards. And those I'm very involved still myself. And I know that there's mealybug. So how come that vineyard is clean of leafroll? A 40, 50, 60, 70-year-old vineyard? Don't tell me it's clean because there's never been a mealybug in that vineyard. So I think that, for me, is extremely interesting because, Professor Pietersen, you say it's mealybug, it's dopplace, or whatever you call it, scale insects. Mainly, there was talk at some stage of root crossing, root grafting. Remember, I asked you this question like 15 years ago. I'm not sure if that's answered. There was also a matter of, was another one, scale insects, mealybug, and root grafting. I can't remember the other one. But if that is so, there must be something else, because why are those 60-year-old vineyards still clean? That's the one thing. But just touching on something else, if I can, Cathy, The question about monoculture versus mixed culture. I really believe that there's, Aidan, a bright future for South Africa, because if this is the quality that we make with Leafroll virus vineyards, can you imagine where we can go with clean vineyards? A lot of people have started planting clean and staying clean. A lot. We follow the protocols. We use Professor Gerhard's son gives a fantastic service where he actually goes with his motorbike through the vineyard and he checks all the vines and he gives you a report. So annually you take, exactly like Aidan said, you take out the rogue, I'm not sure if there's an Afrikaans word for that, you rogue the infested vines and you plant clean and you stay clean. And there's a couple of farms, Creation, Bergleeren, Lormara, Riviksrivier, Takora, that has now been clean for 10, 15 years. So you can do it, but it's not more work actually, it's just a commitment. But I think there's a big chance after, especially at a time like this in South Africa, where people are going to not be able to sell their grapes so easily because of the economy, that people are going to take out virus vineyards and start clean and stay clean, because there's such a big difference between wine from a Leafroll vineyard and wine from a clean vineyard. We've done it, we've tasted it, apart from the yield that is also higher and better. But lastly, soil health means a lot, can help you a hell of a lot, and biodiversity in fighting Leafroll. And I do a lot of spreading of natural insects, those natural predators. I'm sure, Aidan, you use them as well. Everybody uses them. All the clever guys, all the clever farm managers and viticulturists, not like me. It took me a couple of years, but that works. And if you have a natural environment, like natural corridors with fynbos, where the little animals and insects can work and migrate and live, they can fight the bad ones. So a natural environment, soil health, and biodiversity is one of the tools you have in your kit to fight Leafroll. Thank you, Cathy.
Thank you, Rosa.
Sorry. Yeah. I see an interesting and maybe somewhat controversial question from Louis from the Betts Winery in Washington State. He's asking, I often hear winemakers in France and the US refer to quality of fruit coming from Leafroll infected blocks as being higher quality. How do you view this? I might have to bring you on, Louis, because to defend your views.
That's actually the first place that I heard that argument was actually in California, where somebody told me that yes, the old winemakers used to prefer virus-infected fruit because it was a natural control for alcohol and a too fruitful character. But I haven't heard that said.
If I can come in there, yes. I mean, 25, 30 years ago, that is what our winemakers also believed. In fact, there's a vineyard on Vergelegen called Nursery, where they went and they collected Leafroll infected vines from all over the country as a source of further infection for the other vineyards. These are all based on perceptions, of course. You know, if you don't have healthy vines that you can compare, then you cannot make this comparison. And I think the experiment that we did 2 years ago, my colleagues at the University of Stellenbosch, where they did the word cloud that I showed earlier, that is basically a double-blind experiment with 30 of the country's top winemakers, and they had no idea what the experiment was about. And basically, they unanimously, over 4 or 5 cultivars, showed that the wine quality from healthy vines was better than that from Leafroll infected vines.
Louis, have you got something to say about that? What's the, if you can bring some of your experience?
I do. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yeah. So, I mean, first off, I wouldn't say that it's my viewpoint, because I'm in the similar situation to you guys, which is I'm here to learn and just to hear the perspectives you guys have. So I haven't had that experience myself. I think it's interesting, but certainly, I mean, there's a podcast I like to listen to called I'll Drink to That by a gentleman that I respect quite a bit named Levi Dalton. And I think he has 300 or 400 episodes. And I'd say probably, I'd say it's probably been mentioned on 50 of those episodes, you know, winemakers lending that opinion. And, you know, I push on a lot of different aspects of winemaking and viticulture here in Washington State. And I capture a ton of data, and I push on a lot of these concepts. So I did, first off, I didn't want you to think that that's my opinion, because it's not. But to think that people don't think that out in the greater wine world, I think is kind of short-sighted, because a lot of people do, I guess, adhere to this belief. And again, like Gerhard had mentioned, without a control to compare it against, they're probably just going on history, tradition, their perceptions of it, without being able to test it against a control. But I'm not convinced that just wholesale they're all inaccurate in their views either. I mean, obviously, hearing what Alastair had to say about working with Cabernet Sauvignon, it sounds pretty clear that in his experience in the grape that you're talking about and what you guys are talking about, that his experience has been that absolutely not. It sounds like he's comparing it to TCA, and I guess my gut would say that that's probably the reality of it in most instances. I just was curious if anybody had any other opinions outside of just that it was negative in every instance, and maybe it is. I'm not lending an opinion either way. It's just a lot of people in my travels and just online, I've heard a lot of people, but maybe they're all wrong too. Like, I'm not sure. Just if anybody had any other opinions on the other side of it.
Can I say something about that, please, Cathy? I think, coming from an old wine, and actually Andre Morgenthal's here as well, from an old wine project perspective, it sometimes is that older vineyards have a lower yield. So a low yield is often better for quality than overcropping. So that could be the one factor why people believe that. And the second factor is that for some reason, very old vineyards, older than 35 years, do not express Leafroll as badly in the quality of the wine as very young vineyards do, because maybe they have a better root, or deeper, not better, a wider, also not deeper, a more complex root structure that's been proven by Professor Evan Archie many, many years ago, and written in his book that was now won some international prize. So it's about the root system, it's about the lower yield, but it's primarily because of the age of the vines. I think older vines have a different quality to in wine than younger vineyards. It might have something to do with that.
So can I ask, are you lending the opinion then that you think that there are instances where it would actually contribute to quality, or are you still saying no?
No, I firmly believe that rate. Are you asking me? Leafroll vineyards don't nearly make as good wine as clean vineyards of that same age would do. That's my opinion. Full stop.
Okay.
On the same side.
Sorry. We had a Cabernet block in the early days at Takora that we inherited that had probably 10% of the vines were virused, and we marked them individually before we removed them. And the first year we flew our NDVI remote sensing in 2001, we mapped out this vineyard in zones A, B, and C. And then there was a fourth zone called V, and the V was for virus. And we picked the A grapes, the B grapes, the C grapes on canopy. And then right at the end, we waited probably another 2 weeks before the V's actually ripened up. And those wines were made individually in separate tanks, all four wines. And for about 3 years before we eventually pulled that vineyard out, that wine was sold off in bulk. It just never, ever made the grade. It came out of the same block. They were just individual vines that had red tags around them, and they were picked separately, as I say, a few weeks later than the rest. So they not only had a lower yield and inferior quality and lower anthocyanins and lower tannins, etc. They also were late And there wasn't one season where in the blind tasting, those V vines came anywhere near the quality of the other ones. And that is out of the exact same block. So our own experience is that, I mean, you can't start to compare virus-infected fruit with healthy fruit. I think people that say that are just people that have got their whole farm is badly infected. They don't have a choice. And what can they say? They're not going to say, sure, I make virus. So they're going to say, this is my best wine.
I think there's a...
Cathy, can you maybe give us I know it's difficult to maybe pick on one variety, but characteristics of flavor that change with, and I'm not talking about 20 vines in a 20,000 vineyard, but if it's a pretty infected vineyard, let's say of Pinotage or Cabernet, let's not pick on Pinotage, but Cabernet Sauvignon, what kind of profile of flavor? I know it reduces color, but flavor. Let's just hear about flavor.
Where are we going? Sorry, who's answering this one?
I was asking Cathy, but Aidan, if you want to.
No. Cathy,
I know
go.
that Gerhard was before showing us the slides with different characteristics, but let's just hear about a major grape like the Cabernet and hear about that specifically.
Well, that's why I said those word clouds were quite interesting, because for me, a virus fruit is a lot greener, is probably the better way of describing it. And that you don't get, and as Alastair said, the fruit intensity is muted on the nose and the palate. And then most certainly for me, it's also a textural thing. See, Rosa? The texture is grippy, but not in a good way. It's more, for me, it's always more stringent and some very much like drinking very dark black tea, and that the astringency gets you, and also a slight bitterness that comes to the fore. But I think, Angela, you would have tasted a lot of virus-infected wines. Do you have anything you'd like to add in your experience about profiles of the wines that you taste with virus?
That's not a nice thing to say about the wines that Angela drinks.
She drinks Rhone and more Rhone.
I've been around a long time, Aidan. I think one descriptor is tomato leaf. You're getting a flavour, but a structure that is raw, unripe. It's short. There's nothing pleasant about it. I think the shortness, the brevity of the whole thing, and the rawness is what one gets from virus-infected Cabernet, especially. Yeah.
And what sort of percentage, Aidan? I'm sorry to keep going on about it, but what kind of percentage of a vineyard you have to have infected to actually taint the pretty bad? Is it 10%, less?
Well, as I say, for the last 20 years, we've removed all the vines on the farm that have it. So we no longer make any wines with any virus. And that particular Cabernet block was the last time we had sort of a commercial size comparison that we individually. So I think that was highlighted by the fact that those wines, our so-called V wines back then, were only virus. So it wasn't a percentage. Those virus vines were put aside and the wine was made from them. So that was an extreme comparison, because a lot of people make slightly infected from slightly infected vineyards. And then that's when maybe your question of the percentage, but that experiment of ours, an experiment, was just, we needed to separate it. The V wines were 100% virus and the rest were canopy selections. So we haven't made any wines with virus vines since 2001, 2002.
Can I pick on Alastair again? Sorry, can I pick on Alastair again? You're replanting a Syrah vineyard, a Shiraz vineyard, aren't you, at the moment?
Needs to unmute himself because Alastair, wait a second.
There we go. Yeah, we've actually just replanted our entire property over the last 7 or 8 years, and we've still got about another 3 years going with fallow parcels, etc., at Kleine Zalze. So it's a full 65 hectares will be replanted by the time we're finished. We've got some Shiraz going into the ground, or Syrah going into the ground this year, but the large majority has been Cabernet over the last few years that we've put into the ground. And yeah, it's quite an important thing. And coming back to the flavor profiles, I mean, I just actually today classified a whole lot of our 2020 red blocks. We scanned through all of them. We went through about 100 samples, and it reiterated to me, it stands out like a sore thumb. Vineyards that have virus, mostly obviously stuff that we're purchasing in, and you're seeing appreciable levels. It's hard to say with any authority what percentage is really going to affect it, but I would say that most people would be surprised at the dramatic effect it can have. And anyone that's blended some wines will know the effect of what 1% can have on the overall blend of a wine and the profile of a wine. And if you just take 1% of really not great fruit and you chuck it in, it can have a significant impact. And this is anecdotal from my experience in various parts of the world, but most probably more so in South Africa, is, and I'll use Cabernet because it's the one I've got the most experience with, you start really seeing appreciable, without a control sample to look against it. If you've got a control sample, I think you'll see it really early at a very low percentage. But if you just anecdotally look at a vineyard over a number of years, you'll start seeing a noticeable tapering off in quality for me on Cabernet from about 10 to 15%. No more than 15%. At 15%, it really starts showing its head quite a lot. Angela mentioned tomato leaf. You start getting those raw, edgy characters come through, and then from there on, the fruit and everything just starts sliding.
So, Cathy, I think, sorry, any other point before we move? You highlighted a couple of other diseases. I know that it might be a quite comprehensive discussion about the Leafroll, but you did want to ask about a couple of other diseases, and if you may.
Okay, yes. The South Africans here, or anybody who know Andre van Rensburg, is going to laugh with me, because we asked Andre if he'd like to participate, and he said, no, thank you, moved on from Leafroll virus, too busy fighting black goo, or you type a dieback. And so I just was going to throw that out there. Are there any vine diseases at the moment that are a large threat to South Africa, or was Andre just blowing me off?
Yeah, I think.
Yep. Go ahead, Aidan.
Yeah, I think Andre is true there in what he was saying, that there's been a lot of focus on the virus, but Eutypa is one of many, but there's a whole collection of wood rotting fungi that are causing extensive damage, and it's another problem where I think it's easier to control, and it's easier to remedy, and it's easier to rejuvenate vineyards that have been infected. Most of these wood rotting funguses take a long time to show symptoms, normally after 10 years. And once they have shown symptoms, it is easy enough to cut out infected parts of the vine. And we've got a system we adopted probably 10 years ago, where when we see the first sign of any of these, and you do see stunted growth up on the shoots, and it's quite easy to identify the symptoms, we lead up a new shoot, and I think you've got some photographs there, 3 pictures, just to show you how we're reworking Sauvignon Blanc, and it's actually a very simple system, and you hardly lose any production. So if you look at that first slide there, and Moshe, if you can open up it, is it going to open up on my side? Sorry, I'm just trying to get it open. Oh, man. Sorry, Moshe, can you handle that slide there?
Yes, I tried here.
Okay.
I thought it was on.
Yeah.
Is that the one?
Yeah, number one. So
Yes.
I don't know if it's come up large. It's staying as a small little thumbnail on my screen. But anyway, so if you look on the left of that photograph, you can see some of those positions have died back and they're a little bit stunted and they're losing growth. So when we see that in a vineyard, we'll lead up a shoot from the ground. In that middle slide, you can see this number 2 is that we will that slide to that shoot to grow alongside the
that's
other.
one. Sorry.
Yeah, for a year. And then in the third slide, we remove the old vine and we're back in production. So, I mean, that's just a simple little remedy that you can do. But again, if you don't attack it when you see it on the first spur position, you can eventually land up like a virus vine and lose the entire vineyard. And these diseases seem to be very, very prevalent in Cabernet Sauvignon and Sauvignon Blanc. They seem to be the most susceptible. And because we're all pruning in the winter months, when it's wet and raining, wounds are susceptible to infection. These fungi are expelling their spores in rainy conditions. So you're sort of fighting the elements at the time when you have to be pruning. But that is, I think it's probably after virus, it's the second biggest disease threat to our vineyards. And again, a lot of poor management, a lot of people who don't seem to be taking it too seriously. And we, like many of the other guys in the panel, buy in fruit and move around, and we see how bad some of the vineyards in the area are. But this one can be managed, and this one is, without having to replant the block, you can do a continual rejuvenation within the vineyard. And we've got blocks where we haven't, if you just look at the production figures, you wouldn't realize that we slowly over time, probably every year, are replacing 10% of the vines. Some of our blocks have almost done a full rejuvenation where we have removed almost down to the last old vine, and it's still the same root system, the same vine. So it is possible, but yeah, I agree with Andre that these diseases can be devastating and they are spreading. And in the climatic conditions like we have in the Western Cape with nice, moist, wet winters, it is a threat if it's not managed properly. But this one is easier to manage, I think, than virus. I don't know, Rosa, I'm sure you've got lots of experience with these vine rejuvenations. She's still there.
She is. It's just now. She muted us. And she muted us.
Yeah, so these are fungal diseases, not virus diseases, but they are a big threat.
Excellent. So I think Rosa wanted to say something, but we just cross-wired with me unmuting her, and she's, yeah, that's now you're on, Rosa.
Sorry, thank you, Aidan. It's just, I just want to throw a question down there. Why are most of the old vines bush vines, goblet pruned vines, and not vertical shoot positioning or spur pruned? Is because we only cut into one or 2 year old wood on bush vines. We hardly ever cut into the old wood. Woodborne diseases is very often, like you say, when we cut at the wrong time. We prune in rainy days in the middle of winter when we don't have a choice. But it also has to do about how you prune and where you prune. Never cut into old wood, only into young wood, because, like I said, most of the old vines in South Africa, 3,000 hectares that we have, I'd say, Andre, 99% of them are bush vines. So, and bush vines, you only always cut at the top. You cut 1 and 2 year old wood. You never cut deeper than that. And I think it might have to do something with that as well.
But spur pruned, you're also only cutting 1 year old wood.
And the old days, Aidan, I think you're a bit younger than me, sorry, but in the old days, we used to cut the spurs off, remember. When I was trained 20 years ago, 30 years ago, we used to cut the spurs off and make big pruning wounds. And that's why I think that these days we're getting more clever, but that's the history of our country.
But I mean, yeah, so we don't ever cut older than the last year's wood off, and we're still getting the disease. So yeah, I mean, we're using trichodermas and we're sanitizing ours, and we're doing all the practices that we have to. But even that, with pruning methods, as I say, we never cut a wound older than last season's wood. We're still getting the disease. So certain areas are so susceptible to it.
Yes, the Swartland is less susceptible to it because we don't get so much rain here.
Some research came out.
Highly susceptible.
Yeah, and then there was some research a few years back showing that even in the growing season, suckering wounds are an
Yes. Yes.
So where we all
That's
thought it was
really
only on
exciting.
midwinter on dormant wood, it is also on green growth. So yeah, I think, but my point is that this can be managed. You can keep it going. You just got to be on top of it.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So I think this one is easier to manage than virus.
Yes.
Probably
Excellent.
quite a difficult question. But for the people who buy grapes or the people who sell wine here, a difficult question. Can you give a rough percentage on the price of a bottle of wine that you spend fighting disease in the vineyard? Could you say that you spend maybe R1 per bottle of wine fighting disease, or is it R2.50 a bottle of wine fighting disease? It's a horrible question, hey?
I think your entire budget, whatever you spend on viticulture, is fighting disease. So I think if you're doing proper viticulture and if you're doing proper vineyard management, whatever that cost is per ton per bottle the whole thing is about it. We don't set aside a number to say this is what we're going to do to control virus or to control eutyper or whatever. Just your entire strategy of vineyard management should be about the disease and the improvement of quality and optimizing your terroir and your site. So I think I can give a number of what our remote sensing adds or costs to a bottle of wine. But virus is just part of your disease strategy. I mean, every farm in the world is spraying for powdery and downy mildew. You're out there, if you're in a bad area, combating botrytis, or there's a whole fruit salad of diseases. These are just two of them we've been speaking about this evening. But so your entire vineyard season is about fighting disease and being clever about it and trying to minimize the chemical usage and trying to see if there's more biological integrated, as Rosa was saying, sort of biodiverse ways of attacking these. And I think that's going to be the more sustainable route than dashing in there with guns blazing and chemicals.
Prof, do you know how much Vergelegen spent on their virus program?
No, I don't. Those sums, it might be a good exercise to do. But no, I don't know.
Okay.
We lost, I think, your microphone. I don't know if everybody, yeah, I think it was a bit difficult to understand. Maybe you can repeat at that point.
Sorry, yes, I say we don't really know the value.
No,
It would actually be a very good exercise to go through to actually determine how much is actually spent, what it costs to get to near elimination of the virus.
I think we exhausted your microphone, Professor Pietersen. I'm sorry, but I think it's a good point. I just want to ask one last question from the audience, and I think we'll wrap it up. But I'm going back to the virus. Maybe that's a good point just to close it. We talked mainly about the virus. Vivian Franks is asking, are flavors more noticeable with the whites versus reds? I don't know if Aidan can add to that, as if you have experience with whites as well as reds.
Yeah, I think probably Alastair is more qualified than me, but the virus of reds is far more noticeable. I mean, because it's not only the flavors, it's the color as well. So you get, apart from all these awful descriptions we've been hearing this evening, you also get poor color. So in tasting virus to non-virus vines, it's more difficult to pick it up in a Chardonnay than it is in a Cab. So yeah, I think the reds stand out as easier to discern between infected and non-infected vines made from those vines.
Excellent. So I think, Cathy, if you want to add anything else, I'll just wrap this up.
I want to say thank you to everybody for joining us, and especially those people who contributed to the conversation. I read an article a few days ago that I think it was Michael Fridjon who equated Leafroll virus in in the vineyards and South Africa's wine industry to foot and mouth disease. And I do think that this article was written about 6 or 7 years ago. And I think at that stage he was right. I do appreciate that there have been great strides made by Viticulturalists and other of South Africa's nurserymen, and that the material that we are planting these days is much, much cleaner than the material we worked with in the past. However, as a couple of you have mentioned on the chat as well as during this discussion, it doesn't help. It does help, Gerhard, if you plant clean material, but if your neighbors are not as committed as you are to fighting the virus, at some stage you are going to get infected again. So it's a group effort to eradicate the virus. And I think we have made great strides, as I said. What's it? Lillian Fontaine is one of our better nursery suppliers. So I think the only way we should go is up, but it's going to take a group effort from the whole industry. And similarly in Israel, Ido. Yeah, that's all.
Excellent. Thank you, everybody. I think we learned greatly from this discussion, but I think what we can take from that is cooperation more than anything. I think Aidan is painted a picture of a standard of excellence that they maintain, but pretty much as to their own level, their own standard. But I think it's important to cooperate within region and even internationally. I think Israel benefited from the South African experience, and other countries can, if they reach out or if there is some programs. But yes, it's definitely something to learn from that kind of experience. I just want to remind you that to let you know that next week we are taking a little break from South Africa. We will return. Cathy has all sorts of ideas great ideas for later in June. But next week it's a complete different tour to East Europe with Caroline Gilby, Master of Wine, that will take us to visit, well, following the book that she wrote, some vineyards in Romania, Bulgaria, and Moldova. So it's different totally. I'm sure it will be fascinating. I will share with you that she came up with a really nice name, but I said let's call it the Europe's final wine frontier. So it's definitely, when you read about these countries, it's definitely a kind of a frontier. And we will, as I said, we'll return to South Africa, and so stay tuned. You can follow on inthevineyardwith.com or on my Instagram. But it's I hope that you benefited from this session. I know it's not as glamorous maybe as a virtual wine tasting, but I think as wine lovers, we can all agree that healthy vineyards, and not ones that just look pretty as autumn leaves, as Aidan said, is definitely in all our interest, wherever we are in the chain. So thank you again, and hopefully see you next week. Thank you.
Goodbye, everybody.
Goodbye.
Thank you.